If you enjoy the story, give it a like and feel free to leave a comment. Also, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon to be the first to hear new cryptid tales. I'm always looking for stories to share, so if you've had your own encounter with the unknown, send me an email at cryptidtalesmel@gmail.com.
It had been 2 years since the night that I saw the Bigfoot down at the low water bridge. It was Halloween night, and I had just dropped my brother off at a party. I decided to cut through the park on the way home. Not that it was quicker or any way a shortcut, but I like driving through the forest of the national park more than skirting along its borders on the highway. I had just reached the low water bridge and slowed down to avoid bottoming out the rear end of the car as I crossed it. As I drove across, I glanced down the creek, and something caught my attention. There, just in the edge of the light from my headlights, was a figure, squatting down on a large rock at the edge of the creek. As I drove past and on off the bridge, my mind wrestled with the thought of a person squatting down at the edge of a creek on Halloween night in the middle of a national park. I looked at the glowing numbers of the clock on the radio. 10:30 p.m. It just didn't make sense. It had to be at most maybe 50 degrees out. It was pretty late for anyone to be out there. And why would they be squatting on a rock by the creek? Well, curiosity got the best of me, and I turned the car around to go back for another look. As I approached the bridge again, I thought to myself that whoever it was had probably taken off. But as I pulled up to the bridge, I could see them still down the creek, squatted down on the rock. I turned my wheel towards the right to angle my car towards them and hit the high beams. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There, about 15 to 20 yards away, wasn't a person, but a creature. As soon as the headlights hit it, the thing stood up and looked directly towards my car. I sat there pressed against the back of my seat in disbelief. It was completely covered in dark reddish-brown hair. Not puffy fur, but long, stringy hair about 4 to 5 inches long from head to toe. The hair on its face was thinner around the eyes, but grew thicker like a beard and blended into the rest of the hair on its upper body. I'm not real sure how tall it was, but it seemed taller than an average man from that distance. It was almost lanky looking, except for the wide shoulders, but you could see the muscles beneath the hair working and flexing as it moved. The freakiest thing of all about the thing was its eyes. They sat under a heavy brow ridge, like those pictures of prehistoric people, but they glowed a bright amber color in the headlights, like the eyes of a deer standing by the road when you drive by them at night. The first thought that popped in my mind was that someone was in a costume, trying to pull a prank. It was Halloween after all. But looking at this thing, that idea quickly disappeared. It was obvious to me that this was no costume, and the eyes were clearly that of something not human. Without taking its eyes off me, or at least looking towards my car, it stepped off the rock and right into the creek with a splash. One step off the rock, another to the opposite bank of the creek, and by the third it was in the cover of the brush and trees on the other side. Gone from sight in 3 fluid steps. I sat there with my mouth hanging open, staring at where the thing had vanished into the trees. I had heard stories growing up in the small town on the outskirts of the park, but I always thought they were just stories to tease us kids. But now I knew they were true. I had just seen my first Bigfoot. The entire incident, or sighting I guess you could call it, only lasted a matter of seconds, not even a minute. But the vision of that thing standing up and looking at me, and then stepping across the creek and into the woods, I must have replayed that over in my head 1,000 times. I can still see it as clear as when it happened to this day. As amazing and life-changing as that moment was, and believe me, it was life-changing for sure, it wouldn't prepare me for the encounter I would have later. The event that would happen a couple of years later on a winter evening in a different part of the park. Something that if I didn't know better, I would have thought it was a dream, but I know it was real. Even if I'd never expect anyone to ever believe me if I told them what happened. I had become obsessed with learning about these Bigfoot creatures after my sighting. I would spend every free moment I had out in the park, walking the creek, camping out alone, trying to catch another glimpse of what I knew was out there. Slowly, over time, I'd catch glimpses here and there. Never anything compared to that Halloween night, but enough to let me know they were there and they were watching. I say they because after a while, I started finding tracks from time to time. Not often, but every now and then. Before long, I started noticing that sometimes the tracks I was finding were different sizes, and one set was noticeably thinner than the others. I decided to start carrying a tape measure and a little notepad and pencil with me when I go on my adventures, and sure enough, I was right. One set of tracks measured a little over 14 inches long and about 6 inches wide. These tracks were sometimes found with another set of tracks that were only about 11 inches long and 4.5 inches wide. But I would always find them together or in the same area as one another. Then, at the beginning of the following spring, I think it was in late March, I found something that explained it all. Down in an old creek bed that no longer held water, I found a set of the usual tracks, but this time they had a different track with them. Just one, but the toes were clear as day, and I could clearly make out the outline of a small, child-sized footprint. Just under 5 inches and a couple inches wide. I had been playing this cat and mouse game with a pair, and they had a baby. I couldn't believe it. I know it seems silly to anyone who isn't me, but at the time, I felt like I had really stumbled onto something. I was excited about this, really excited. Over the past couple of years, I had grown what I felt like was a connection with these things, and now a new one was introduced to the world, and I felt as if I was part of it. Even though in reality, I knew I was just another person in the woods for them to avoid. Shortly after my finding, something strange happened. The Park Service came in and shut down the area of the national park that I was in. They blocked off the road going in and out of the area, and even put up a temporary chain link fence across the trails that led into it. No trespassing signs were posted everywhere. The word around town was that the area was closed due to new road construction. But for the next 6 months that it was closed, not a single road was built, not even a new trail. The months went by, and I was forced to continue my searches in different areas of the park. I thought maybe with the fences and such that the family group would have relocated to a different area as well, but I never found any sign of them. In fact, I had given up hope altogether pretty much. Somehow, the park had found out what I was doing and shut it down right when I started figuring stuff out. That's what I convinced myself of, at least. I have no idea how they would have known. It's not like I told anyone what I was doing or what I was finding. Eventually, I found myself going out on hikes less and less, and camping out had completely stopped. The truth was something was wrong with me. I think I knew it, or maybe even felt it and just didn't realize it. Regardless, that October, just shy of the 2-year anniversary after my sighting, I found myself in the hospital recovering from a mild stroke. For anyone who has ever had a mild stroke, you know as well as I do, there doesn't seem anything mild about it. I didn't even know someone my age at the time could have one, but I certainly did, and it took a lot out of me. Fortunately, I was young, and my recovery went pretty quickly. By that Thanksgiving, I had pretty well fully recovered, and was starting to go on walks and exercise to try and get my strength back to where it used to be. It was the first or second week of December, and the first snow had dusted the ground. I loved the way the woods looked when it snowed, so I decided to take a drive through the park. I hadn't been in the park since I got out of the hospital, and to my surprise, the fences and signs were now gone. My old stomping grounds were reopened, even though there were clearly no new roads. The image of those Bigfoot tracks I had found popped in my head as I pulled into the parking area at the trailhead that leads down into the creek bottom where I had found the prints. As if I was being drawn to the place, I couldn't help but wonder. I put the car in park and turned off the key. I sat there for a minute or two, maybe longer, thinking about the Bigfoot and wondering if they were still around after all that time. I decided to go ahead and hike down there. I grabbed a candy bar out of the glove box. I had started keeping candy with me after getting out of the hospital for when I started feeling winded, and knew this was probably going to be one of those times. I put the candy bar in my shirt pocket and took off down the trail. I had followed the trail and then went down into the old creek bed looking for tracks, but didn't find anything. There was no sign of the Bigfoot anywhere. It was getting later in the day, and I was starting to get kind of lightheaded, so I decided to cut across through the woods off the trail to take a shortcut back to the car. I came walking out of the tree line and into a large opening that had a large hill on one side and was surrounded by woods and embankments on the other. It formed like a natural bowl, and a big old sycamore tree grew right in the middle. I decided to squat down at the base of the tree and rest a few minutes before hiking up the hill and back to the car. As I rested, I'm not sure how long it had been, no more than a few minutes or so, I heard a stick snap off in the woods behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I sat there listening, I quickly heard what sounded like muffled footsteps from the trees, almost like someone was walking up that old creek bed. The sound of the steps kept coming closer, but I didn't hear any voices. I thought to myself to calm down, it was probably just a deer, but it really did sound like a person. I sat there for a few more moments, and then the sound of the steps kept coming, but started slowing down. Now from the woods on the opposite side of the tree from where I was sitting, directly behind me, I was hearing something taking a step, then slowly taking another one, with huge pauses in between. My heart started thumping in my chest. Then, quiet. Complete silence. No stepping, no birds chirping, nothing. I think if it had started snowing again, you could have heard the snowflakes hitting the ground, it was so quiet. Using the tree against my back as a balance, I slowly turned and moved around to the side of the tree to look behind me. Standing there, just outside the tree line, was a female Bigfoot. It was clear that it was a female. She had rust-colored hair and big, dark eyes. She was staring right at me, not moving a muscle. She wasn't as tall as the first one I had seen, but still easily as tall as I was, and had more weight on her. Her body was angled towards me, but the hand that I could see had long fingers, and she was curling them into sort of a fist and then straightening them back out. As I sat there taking all of this in, a rush of fear swept over me. I realized she wasn't trying to get back into the trees. She wasn't running away. She was standing there staring right back at me. Was she going to attack me? What should I do? Should I run? Before I could decide on what I should do, she slowly squatted down on her heels, never taking her eyes off me, and let out a quick, high-pitched whistle. The tree line behind her erupted with a crash, and a much smaller creature came piling out on all fours, scampering up to her, and grabbing a hold of her shoulders from behind, as if it were hugging her back. Could it be? I thought to myself as I did my best to maintain some sort of realization as to what was going on. It was like my mind was struggling to process what I was experiencing, and I had to focus to keep my thoughts from disappearing into a blank void inside my head. But could this be the mother and baby of the tracks I had found a half year ago? I sat there, now having time to process, and decided it was best not to try and leave, but to avoid direct eye contact as well. I kept my head turned slightly to the side, but kept watch out of the corner of my eye. Every few seconds, the little one would peek out from behind the female and take a look at me, and then look back at her. After a few times of doing that, it started to slowly move out from behind her and was now next to her. He was smaller than her by quite a bit, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, but never stood completely upright. His hair was fuzzy and not much longer than a couple inches, and seemed thicker than hers and the other one I had seen. It was a lighter shade as well, almost like a wicker basket in color. After what seemed like several minutes, the young one started walking around a bit on all fours, and bit by bit started making its way towards the tree I was at. It would take a few slow steps, then turn and look at her, then back at me. Then it would run back to her. It continued doing this, like it was trying to build up courage and make sure with Mom that it was safe. When it finally got to a point where it was closer to me than it was to her, the female made a grunt sound and sat up a bit. It turned and looked at her, but didn't run back. Instead, it stayed where it was and sat down on the ground. A few seconds later, the female eased up a bit and relaxed. At this point, my mind was racing. I didn't know what to think, what to do, but I knew I had to do something. Then it dawned on me. I had the candy bar in my pocket. I very slowly reached with my hand into my pocket and pulled the bar out and began unwrapping it. As soon as the crinkling started, the female jerked back up, grunted, and the young one ran back to her side, gripping onto her arm. But they didn't leave. I very slowly pulled back the wrapper, making sure my fingers didn't actually touch the candy bar itself, but only the wrapper. I pulled it down about halfway, exposing the candy, and extended my arm out towards them. The young one tilted its head back and started sniffing the air. I sat there motionless, with my arm and the candy bar extended out. It let go of the female's arm and started walking on its knuckles back towards me again. The female grunted again, and the young one stopped and looked back at her, but it didn't run back. It slowly made its way in a zigzag line closer to me. When it got back to that same spot it had been before, where it was closer to me than it was to her, it squatted back down on the ground. Now, not only could I see its little nostrils flaring in and out, I could hear the air rushing in and out of its nose as well. It smelled that candy bar. At this point, I started to think to myself that this was probably a bad idea. I didn't know how this thing was going to react, and I started to question what I was even doing. For all I knew, this thing would just latch onto my hand with its teeth, and then what would I do? Maybe I should just drop the candy bar on the ground or toss it towards him. Before I could make a decision, the little one shot towards me, quicker than I could comprehend. It snatched the candy bar from my fingertips and ran back to the female. I yanked my sore, stiff arm back to my side in a knee-jerk reaction and almost toppled over. The female just sat there, still keeping her eyes locked on me, as the young one devoured the sweet, sticky chocolate bar and was already licking the wrapper for any bits it might have missed. I couldn't believe what had just happened, what had just taken place. I had just hand-fed a Bigfoot. My excitement at the situation was suddenly penetrated by a sound. A loud sound I have a hard time describing, sort of a grunt and a huff mixed together, coming from the direction of the hill. Without thinking, I turned my head towards the sound and soon realized what it was. There, on top of the hill across from me, was a much, much larger Bigfoot. He was massive compared to the others. This one was at least, 8 or 9 feet tall maybe, and his shoulders were at least twice as wide as any person I had ever seen. His hair was a dark brown, almost black, with some lighter brown mixed in, and his head came to a point, not as rounded as the others. I knew instantly this was Dad. I don't know how long he had even been there. He might have been there the whole time. I wouldn't have known it if he hadn't made a noise. At first, I didn't realize that I had essentially turned my back on the female and the young one, but this guy had my complete attention. He was massive and intimidating, a true ruler of the woods, and I was terrified. The female and the young one went walking by me a good 20 yards out, giving me a wide berth as they made their way towards the big male. The female was no longer keeping her eyes on me, but the male was locked onto me. I knew one wrong move, and I wasn't making it out of those woods. The two of them walked up the hill and past the male. I watched as they disappeared out of view on the other side, but the male stood there, never looking at them, but only at me. Once they were long out of view, and I couldn't even hear them anymore, the huge male dropped down on his knuckles and let out a loud huff. I couldn't tell if those big dark eyes were looking at me with anger or disgust, but I understood the message. He slowly turned and disappeared from view on the backside of the hill. I quickly raised to my own feet, and with a pounding heart and a gasp of air, tears started falling down my cheeks. I felt overcome with emotion. I was happy, I was terrified, I was everything. And I was most importantly, alive. I actually decided to take the long way back to the vehicle after that. Not only did the trail somehow feel safer now, but the Bigfoot had gone the direction I was originally headed, and after staring eye to eye with that big male, I wanted to give them as much space as possible. By the time I saw my vehicle again, the tears had stopped, and I was starting to feel somewhat back to normal, but very exhausted. I couldn't believe what had just happened, what I had just witnessed, but to me, it almost felt like justification. I felt that all those ridiculous feelings I had about feeling a connection to them, and the emotions I had when I found those tracks 6 months ago, they were now confirmed. Of course, it's just a story, and I have no way to prove any of it. Most people would say that I'm probably wrong about the way I felt. They would laugh at me if I told them that the Bigfoot had let me know that we did share a connection, and they had allowed that meeting to happen. But when I got back to my car that day, and I found that crinkled up candy bar wrapper laying on my windshield wiper, I knew I was right.